Hello. We are doing this interview in a very complicated historical context, let's say it. And it is again about Russia. History has its little ironies, let's say it. You tell the story in your book of your country using a story of a border with three openings: Bulgaria, Greece, and Turkey. Here, at this border, many lost their lives trying to flee to free West. It's Strandja region. But they are not only Bulgarians. There are also est-germans who lost their life here. So why did you choose this specific story for telling the story of Bulgaria, let's say?
It's a great pleasure to be talking to you, first of all. And why? Because it is the border of my childhood. It is the border that, in a way, made me who I am. It is our shared border for half of us Europeans who are alive then. It was our Iron Curtain, and I think it made us who we are. You know, those generations who lived in the shadow of the Iron Curtain, one way or another, it made us who we are today. And you said there were different nationalities, all from the Eastern Bloc, trying to run across this militarized zone. And there were Romanians among them. I am so happy that the book is now out in Romanian as Frontiera. It makes me so happy that even though the Romanian-Bulgarian border is not part of this particular book, in a way it is. And before it came out in Romanian, a couple of years ago, I received an email from a Romanian reader who read it in English with his wife. And they shared their family story of his wife's brother, who had been one of those young people trying to cross from Bulgaria into Yugoslavia, so the western border. And he was returned in a coffin. And there are Romanian stories on that border too. These are our stories.
You know, under communism, you said this region of Strandja functioned as a Berlin Wall, Iron Curtain, Berlin Wall. But what did people knew at that time about the situation on this border, about the escape attempts, about the crimes happening here?
What did Bulgarians know?
Yeah.
You know, I think there are different kinds of knowledge, and even the word itself was taboo, graniță in Bulgarian. I don't know. I suspect in Romanian the word frontiera was also.
And we have graniță also.
Graniță.
It's
okay. Okay. What is the difference in Romanian between graniță and frontiera?
I believe that frontiera, it's between an external country. Granița could be internal also. I believe so. They are synonyms, actually.
Yes. So there are different kinds of knowledge. And I think for ordinary people, it was very clear that the graniță was a no-go zone. It was a deadly zone. And in Bulgaria, it was a perimeter of about 20 to 30 kilometers from the actual fence. That was a heavily militarized zone where you needed a special document to even visit. And even the locals who lived in that militarized zone, the people of the border needed a special document to live there. And as I traveled on the Greek and Turkish side, I found that it had been the same on the Greek and Turkish side. So I think people knew nothing of the details. Ordinary people knew nothing of the details of what happened to fugitives. But it was an unspoken knowledge that, if you approach that zone, you will be arrested or shot. Even children knew it. And I think for children, the sense of kind of threat and injustice that living with the Iron Curtain involved is a kind of knowledge. It's a kind of intuitive, almost physical knowledge of paranoia, fear, things that need to be spoken but are not spoken. So they become stuck somewhere in your system, in the system of the family, of the whole, of the whole nation. It becomes this unspoken truth, this kind of scream waiting to come out, becomes part of national culture almost. And I think it remained with us in the transition, in the post-communist transition.
So could be trauma inherited?
Yes, we have inherited trauma. It's one of my favorite themes, how we inherit the trauma, but also, the gifts of our ancestors, of the previous generations, and how we work through them, how we process them or not. So I'm very interested really in what happens before an event, a big event, a collective event, and what happens after. And this book is really the story of all of that. What led to living in a kind of open-air prison, but also what followed. When I went to the border in 2013 and decided to write about this, I thought I was only going to write about the legacy of communism and of the Cold War. In a way, try to speak those truths that were not spoken in my childhood. But I discovered a much more complex landscape, a kind of border world, which goes back to, 100 years ago, to the Balkan Wars and World War I, and to the various empires, the Ottoman Empire, that fell apart and created these modern borders, because this is really a geography that hadn't known such definite borders before. So it's really a very new border with a very big history. And of course, the next empire was the Soviet Empire. And that is when the physical border, the actual fence, the actual Iron Curtain appeared on the ground.
So when does the border open and when does it close? A border in general, because it can close a country or open a country.
Well, the physical border is no longer there. It was after the fall of the regime. It was scrapped and sold as old scrap. Literally the scrap heap of history. It was sold by locals. You can still see some sections of it still standing near the Black Sea coast. And it's an interesting site because, of course, nature has reclaimed it. So it's very green, very lush. And it looks like a very small kind of ordinary fence. But you can still see which way the barbed wire, which used to be called, it was called by soldiers the klon. You can see which way the klon points, and it points inwards to the inmates. So really, to the enemy within. And that really became the big, sort of one of the big, I suppose, themes of these stories I collected, these border stories, how border culture is born, how it is a kind of war. Border culture, even in times of peace, is a form of warfare, a kind of chronic warfare. And I think a border disappears when it disappears from our minds. You know, when we no longer are controlled by our mental borders. And really the shadow of the border has been very long. The ghosts of the border are still alive, and we can see it in what's happening today.
Yeah, I know, because one of my favorites Bulgarian region is Sinemorets and Strandja region. So I've been there many times. You are talking about a border with 3 countries: Bulgaria, the Balkans, Greece, Europe, part of the West back then, and Turkey, Asia, let's say it. How about the people living in this area? Are they alike, Bulgarians, Turkish people, and Greek people?
You know, people are alike everywhere. And perhaps especially in border zones, ironically. Even when they don't know that they are alike, and even when they stress how different they are, if they are affected by this border mentality, this border syndrome, which you do find in some, you know, people who've been brainwashed by the Cold War. Even those people share more than, in a way, the people of this border share more than they share with the capital cities of their own countries. And over time, I heard similar stories on all 3 sides. So, for example, I collected so many stories, it was difficult to have to lose some of them. But, for example, I heard the story of a Turkish shepherd who in the 70s had been at the border river with his horse, and he saw a Bulgarian shepherd on the other side of the river, and he waved and said merhaba, and the other shepherd waved back but didn't say anything because he was too afraid. Each of them were afraid of their own armies, and eventually the Turkish shepherd was in fact arrested by the Turkish border army and accused of national treason, spent time in jail, lost everything, and eventually was released, amnestied during a change of regime. But he ended up hanging himself in the forests of Strandja. And this is an example of how border culture works against those very people that it pretends to protect. And there are many stories like that on the Bulgarian side. These are Cold War stories, but there are also, stories at the time when I was there. I wanted to meet some of the people coming from Syria, from Iraq. And, the border revealed itself as almost a kind of vortex, a kind of time vortex, where different historic eras, different moments in time converge.
So, in this book, you are talking about a paradox, like Grossman's paradox in Pantarei. A border guard who loves very much his son and cries for him, and at the same time having no, let's say, guilty conscience in killing in the past the son of others, people who just wanted to escape the dictatorship and live in a free world. How is this paradox possible? Good and evil in the same...
Well, that paradox is, is with us. We see it in people who defend the indefensible, and yet continue to be human and have their own dramas. And I think in psychology that's called cognitive dissonance. When I think a part of our conscience is so affected by propaganda, by some kind of ideology or some kind of idea or some kind of opinion. It's always abstract. It's always in the abstract, this world of opinion. And other parts of us remain human at the same time. And I think a lot of people, it is one of the challenges, I think, of our time, dealing with cognitive dissonance, with denial. Denial is it can almost become part of national culture. And I think in the Balkans, certainly, historical denial is very much part of official national history. Where certain things are cleansed from the official narrative, whereas others are kind of magnified and stressed, and that creates the kind of national myth, usually involving victimhood and martyrdom, and never really addressing the darkness within.
Could this denial explain the nostalgia for communism in our countries?
Yes, yes, it could. It could, and I think it's a kind of this inherited trauma that you mentioned. I think part of the trauma is a refusal, and is a kind of blindness, an inability to look at ourselves first of all, and yes, it's complex, and it's also generational. But I think what it comes down to in the end is real experience, having real human experience. I think that is one of the ways to counter this very dangerous world of ideology, of opinions, war of opinions, where language becomes everything, but experience is forgotten, the human being is forgotten. So we have to get in touch with our human experience to regain,
please.
To regain a hold of reality, of what is actually real.
In Germany, we had this, let's say, culture, children coming to their fathers, asking them, "Father, how could you be a Nazi?" In communist countries, our generation doesn't have this culture, asking our parents, how was it like? Why?
Yes, we haven't had what the Germans call Vergangenheit, Bewältigung, coming to terms with the past. Perhaps it's different in Romania, I don't know, but in Bulgaria, it hasn't really happened. There have been small pockets.
It's the same in Romania. We share this attitude toward our past, our communist past. This area, Bulgaria, is multi-ethnic. But what did the nationalism in the communist Bulgaria look like?
I'm sorry, I didn't get the question. Just the last question.
What did the nationalism in the communist Bulgaria looks like? Because this specific area is very multi-ethnic.
Of course, all of the Balkans are multi-ethnic, and it's part of multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multi-everything. It's, the Balkans, this is one of our great riches that, again, we deny. We are blind to our own treasures because we are, this wonderfully sort of rich ecosystem of people and nature. And during communism, I guess, I address this in the book. There are a few stories of what happened to the ethnic Turks of Bulgaria during communism.
And to Pomac, what we call Pomac.
Yes, to the Bulgarian-speaking Muslims, the Pomaks. It was the greatest crime of the Bulgarian communist regime. The terror campaigns against first the Pomaks and then the ethnic Bulgarian Turks, there were several waves of this in the 60s, then the 70s, and then finally in the 80s, which resulted in a mass exodus, the largest exodus of people since World War II. And indeed, until the Yugoslav wars, a few years later, and until now. The exodus of the Bulgarian Turks happened during peacetime, in fact. It was, in the last year of the Cold War, but it was, a country at peace, presumably, yet the communist government was conducting effectively a kind of campaign of terror against its own citizens with the aim of de-orientalizing the cultural heritage of the country. And the idea was to change people's names. Even the names of the dead had to be changed so that Muslim graveyards were destroyed, people were killed. And this remains, again, a little kind of discussed chapter. It's much more than a chapter. It was in fact, the first expression of mass civil protest against the communist government of Bulgaria, and one of the biggest in the whole of the Eastern Bloc, when the Pomaks rebelled. 2 or 3 villages in the Pomak communities of southern Bulgaria did a kind of peaceful sit-out for a couple of months in the winter of 72-73. It was an unprecedented act of, civil protest. And it really, we should be proud of that. It should go down in history because these peasants, these people of the land on whom the tobacco harvest depended, who are actually filling the pockets of the state with their labor, were brave enough to stand before the tanks, because there were tanks sent there by the government, with their bare hands, women, men. They sat out the winter, just waiting to receive an explanation why their names had to be changed, from Ahmed to Asen, or Aisha to Asya. And,
the Bulgarian names.
Yeah, to the so-called Slavic or Bulgarian or, names. It was, of course, only one stage in this campaign that the ethnic national state has had since its beginning, to turn this multi-ethnic ecology into a kind of monolithic entity. And it was part of this monolithic communist ideology that, top-down power, everything should be monolithic and monocultural. Buildings, people, clothes, behavior, even nature.
This region is, in your book, almost a mystical area. The worshippers of fire who live there. You have legendary springs, chishma, and water fountains with different powers. People believed in powers of chishma. It's the same word actually in Romanian. It's a Turkish word.
Do you use chishma?
I use chishma in Moldova, where I was born, not in Bucharest. So it's a Turkish word.
Yes. And there are many Turkish words still, in Balkan languages. Yes, I am very interested in these, you might call them pagan traditions. I'm interested, and that's why I wrote about the fire worship rites that still survive in Strandja and also in a few villages in northern Greece, where people are actually descendants of refugees from Bulgaria, from the Black Sea. So it seems that this cult of fire, which is a seasonal harvest cult, later connected with Christianity.
I believe it's Nestorians.
Okay. Nestinari. Anastenarides in Greek. It's the same thing. It is, of course, a pagan thing. And above all, it is one of the many nature venerations that still, because really, I think Westerners in particular, in Western culture, when you say the Balkans, people don't think about extraordinary nature and the last clean rivers in Europe. But that is one of the defining things about the Balkans, and it is something I discover again and again when I travel to these slightly off the beaten track places, that our greatest treasure after the people, or perhaps before the people, is our ecosystems, our clean rivers, our forests, our mountains, and of course the link between the human being and the forest, this understanding of the deeper forces that operate. And I'm interested in this kind of, I suppose, deeper dimension of what we call events. And yeah.
Did you heard a story that you couldn't tell in your book?
I had many stories which I didn't tell in the book, simply because they were quite similar to other stories that are in the book. So I also had to be careful not to how to handle people's lives, because the greatest gift a writer like me can receive is the story of someone's experience, especially when it's a life and death experience. So there were certain details that didn't go into the book in order to protect the people. And the book would have been more sensational, perhaps, or even more, some people say, this reads like fiction, but reality is stranger than fiction. And I didn't include some of these details because they are too sensitive for these individuals. But the border is a very ambiguous place. And there are certain people in the book who really, for me, embody the border. And Zico is one of those characters. Zico, who was a people smuggler and then became a dog smuggler. And I spent a few days with him, and that is one of the journeys I describe in the book, when we crossed the Bulgarian-Greek border together, and what I discover in those days.
Do you plan to return there, to live there maybe?
To live there? No. I always plan to return, but I haven't yet. And that old saying, you can't cross the same river twice.
Yeah. Heraclit.
And since I completed the book, some of the places where I visited became militarized again, in the next couple of years after I wrote the book, because of the refugees, so-called refugee crisis. So new fences went up in place of the old fences.
Did you talk with your friends from this book? How was the book perceived in Bulgaria, in Strandja region?
Yes, I have stayed in touch with quite a few of the people, in particular in the last section where I talk about the Turkish side of Strandja mountain, and where I'm with a guide and a translator and a wonderful photographer. Without him, I couldn't have done it. He's the descendant of Bulgarian Pomaks from World War I. They became refugees because of atrocities and by various armies, most likely the Bulgarian army, and were forced to emigrate to Turkey, like many Muslims at the time. And he's the grandson of these refugees, and he still speaks Bulgarian. So he was my guide. And
you also live in exile. How does exile change a person?
Well, I don't see myself as an exile because this is a choice, you know. My family emigrated from Bulgaria in the early 90s, so we were really economic immigrants. And we emigrated to New Zealand, but then I returned to live in Europe. I now live in Scotland. I think leaving the land of your childhood always changes a person. And I think there's a big difference between exile, you know, political exile, and emigration. But I think a return is always complicated. And I think in a way, you know, border is a return. And it started as a personal return, as a personal kind of, as a personal gesture, almost like a pilgrimage to this demilitarized zone, which then became militarized again in the last few years. But it quickly started feeling like a collective kind of return, a collective pilgrimage, a kind of collecting, exercising of our shared ghosts, really. You know, that scream that didn't come out. And that still lives in the border zone, and it's in the people. And when you start talking to the people and visiting these places, you can even read between the lines of what people say, like with that old man you mentioned whose son was killed, but he himself was a killer. He killed several fugitives, border fugitives. He shot them in cold blood. And he has to live with that now. You have to read between the lines sometimes, because silence is also powerful.
It's my last question. In the last year, you have mentioned, we often talked about guarding Europe's border, let's say it. And the discussions about borders are more and more important these days. How do you see this discussion?
Well, I think borders are doomed. I mean, borders as we know them are already slipping into the past as we speak. And I mean, there is no doubt. You can see it on the ground. You know, you go and see the remains of the Iron Curtain. There is no doubt that history has proven it, that the fate of every border is to collapse eventually. Because it is really it is the incarnation of ideology, of separation, of division, and of war. And these are kind of these are creations of our culture, you know, of the patriarchy, really, which are doomed. I think the patriarchy is, we are seeing it now. We are seeing its face. And for me, the border is when war, you know, acquires a body, and it's a kind of echo. The border reminds us of all the wars that led to this border, because there is no border without war. And we haven't seen the end of it, but I think the discussion is ongoing. It is inevitable, and I think we just need to keep bringing ourselves back to experience, real experience, you know, on the ground with other people. That is what brings borders down and what ends wars.
Thank you very much for this talk.
Thank you. Thank you. It was a pleasure.